She was just a young elephant, lost in the cold mist, her leg wounded by a cruel trap, and her herd long gone. And he was a leopard, feared and forgotten, his body marked by old battles. But in that moment, under the silent trees, something happened that no one could explain. If you believe the wild can still surprise us with kindness, then stay with us. Like and subscribe to our channel and let this story unfold. One step, one breath, one scar at a time. Autumn had arrived early in the Blue Ridge Mountains, brushing the forest in North Carolina with hues of rusted gold and copper. The air was crisp, the kind that bit gently at the skin and carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves. A fog hovered like a ghost over the forest floor, softening the outlines of the dense woods. Somewhere beyond the silence of pines and oaks, a soft whimper rose and vanished into the breeze, a sound barely noticeable, unless one was truly listening. 3 miles off the edge of the Blue Haven Wildlife Reserve, Ranger Ben Harlan tightened his jacket against the morning chill. He was a man of quiet presence, around 55, with deep lines etched into his sun-kissed skin and a slight limp in his left leg, an old injury from a time long gone. His dark beard, peppered with gray, framed a face weathered not only by years under the open sky, but also by grief. A widower for nearly a decade, Ben had since poured his soul into this sanctuary, finding solace in the creatures that never asked for explanations. He paused beside a patch of broken underbrush, crouching slowly. Blood. Faint smears, still damp, trailing off into the deeper part of the forest. Next to it, he spotted a footprint oddly round, too wide for deer, too light for bear. His heart sank. An elephant calf. Ellie was the youngest member of their small herd, a 3-year-old with large, gentle eyes and ears far too big for her head. Her playful nature had made her a favorite among the staff, especially Laura, Ben's 10-year-old daughter. Though Ellie had been born into the reserve, she had always shown a spirit for wandering just a bit farther than the rest. Today, that curiosity had led her into danger. Ben touched the radio strapped to his shoulder. Ellie might be hurt. I've got blood on the North Trail, headed toward Briar Hollow. Request backup and med kit team. But before the static faded, he froze. There was something else paw prints, large, 4-toed, predatory. Yet strangely, they didn't follow the blood. They paralleled it. Miles away, a figure watched from atop a sun-drenched ridge where the trees broke into golden meadows. Scar. That was the name whispered among the locals, though no one had given it to him directly. A wild leopard, nearly 7 years old, larger than average, with a pelt once sleek but now marred with stories. Scars crisscrossed his flank and legs, evidence of fights. Some won, some narrowly survived. His left ear was torn at the tip, his tail kinked from a healed fracture. But it was his eyes amber, calm, unreadable, that made him unforgettable. Scar had lived on the fringes of Blue Haven for years, never captured, never collared, just shadows and sightings. He kept to himself, hunting in the far edges, avoiding humans and other predators alike. He did not trust. He did not linger. But this morning, something drew him back. Down in the hollow, Ellie had collapsed. The trap an old illegal snare likely set by poachers had caught her rear leg. The wire had sliced deep, turning her gentle gray skin into a canvas of red and mud. She cried again, softer this time, barely more than breath. And yet, to Scar, it might as well have thundered. He moved with silence born of years surviving against the odds, slipping through the shadows until he reached a boulder overlooking the grove. He lay low, tail curled, watching. No wolves, no buzzards. Just the calf alone, bleeding, shivering with fear. He could leave, he should leave, but he didn't. Back at the ranger outpost, another day was beginning. Inside the main lodge, Laura Harlan sat cross-legged by the window, a sketch pad in her lap. Her long auburn hair was pulled into a loose braid, and her fingers were smudged with pencil and leaf crayon. Diagnosed with high-functioning autism at age 6, Laura saw the world in patterns, colors, and feelings others missed. She rarely spoke unless she had something urgent to say. Today she was unusually focused. On her page was a drawing, a large spotted creature standing in front of a smaller one with wide ears. It was rough, but unmistakable. Her mother, Dr. Marion Thorne, a wildlife behaviorist visiting for the season, paused by the doorway. A tall woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones softened by tired eyes, Marion carried the air of someone constantly balancing data with motherhood. "That's a strange pair," she remarked, peering over Lara's shoulder. Lara simply said, "He's watching her." Back in the hollow, the sun climbed higher. Ellie tried to rise but collapsed again, her trunk dragging through the leaves. Scar stirred, ears twitching. A crow cried out above, circling once. He stood, padded down the slope, slow, deliberate. Not like a predator. Not this time. Ben arrived 20 minutes later, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air. He slowed when he spotted the scene. Ellie lay motionless near a thorny bush. But it wasn't the blood that froze him. It was the shadow seated 10 yards away. The leopard. Instinct told him to raise his rifle, but something in the posture stopped him. Scar wasn't crouched to pounce. He was still, relaxed, yet alert. His body sat like a statue between the calf and the rest of the forest, guarding. Ben didn't move, didn't call. He reached for the camera slung at his hip and snapped a single shot not for documentation. But so he'd remember, this moment wasn't imagined. From the hilltop, Lara stepped out of the arriving jeep and walked straight toward the scene, her boots crunching softly. Marion followed, calling, "Lara, stop!" But the girl didn't. She moved without fear, her eyes locked on Ellie. Scar stood slowly, his body tense. Marion lunged forward, but Ben raised a hand. "Wait!" Lara stopped 10 feet away, knelt, and whispered something inaudible. Scar blinked once, then stepped back, not into the forest, but just enough to let her pass. Lara reached the calf, gently touching Ellie's ear. The elephant stirred slightly, a small flutter of recognition. Scar didn't leave. He watched. The sun lit his side, outlining the scars like old rivers across a map. The chapter closed not with roars or rescues, but with breath. 3 beings, 1 human and 2 wild, holding a moment that no textbook could explain. The next morning in Blue Haven rose quietly, with the kind of calm that made one question if the previous day had happened at all. Mist clung to the undergrowth like a veil, softening the harsh truths buried in the soil. But for Ranger Ben Harlan, there was no forgetting. He had replayed the scene all night, the elephant calf bleeding, the leopard standing guard, and his daughter Lara stepping into it all, as if guided by something no adult logic could grasp. Inside the ranger station, Ben sipped lukewarm coffee, his hands still trembling slightly. He stared at the photo he'd printed from his camera, Scar, sitting tall, gaze fixed on Ellie, with Lara's silhouette faintly visible in the corner. He had planned to send it to the State Wildlife Authority, but he hadn't yet. There was something sacred about the moment, something not meant to be dissected by forms and regulations. In the adjoining room, Lara sat cross-legged on her cot, drawing again. This time, it wasn't Scar or Ellie. It was the forest itself, detailed and chaotic, branches curling like whispers. She worked with fierce concentration, pausing only to brush back her braid or hum under her breath. Despite everything, she seemed calm. That unnerved Ben more than anything. Meanwhile, in the forest beyond the reserve's fence, Scar was on the move. The great leopard padded through the underbrush like a ghost, weaving between trees with barely a sound. His left forepaw had a shallow cut from the previous day's fight. A twisted root had snagged him as he chased off a lone coyote sniffing near Ellie. It wasn't deep, but it throbbed with every step. Still, he moved, always moving. He wasn't returning to the calf that morning, not yet. Instead, he was following something else, the scent of men, not rangers, not tourists. These tracks were fresher, rougher, boots with mismatched treads, cigarette ash near a broken stump, human, careless and recent. Scar stopped at a spot where the wind shifted and narrowed his eyes. There was metal here, faint and buried, another snare, poorly concealed. Back at the clinic, Ellie lay under the care of 2 staff veterinarians. One of them, Rose Nguyen, was a petite woman in her early 30s with a quiet confidence and sharp hands. Her dark brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she wore a soft green hoodie over her scrubs. Rosa had grown up in Atlanta, but had come to Blue Haven to escape hospital bureaucracy. Her empathy extended beyond animals. She treated every creature like it was her last chance to make something right. "She's stable," Rosa said, glancing at the vitals displayed on a portable monitor. but the leg is infected. We need to remove the snare wire fragments before noon, or it'll start to necrotize. The other vet, Dr. Jamal Turner, tall and broad-shouldered with gray streaks in his short curls and a baritone voice, gave a slow nod. Originally from Baltimore, Jamal had once worked with elephants in Kenya. He had the calm of a man who'd seen the worst and didn't panic easily. "I'll prep the sedative," he said, and left the room with a steady stride. As they worked, Lara sat by the observation window, knees pulled to her chest. She didn't look at the elephant. She watched the tree line beyond the fence, eyes darting from shadow to branch. She was waiting. In the woods, Scar had begun circling back, this time not toward Ellie directly, but around the perimeter of the reserve. He was tracking not out of curiosity, but instinct, predator or not. He understood danger. And he had scented something worse than blood. Gun oil. At noon, the surgery began. Rosa and Jamal worked quickly, removing fragments from Ellie's leg with precision. The calf whimpered under sedation, but the bleeding was controlled, the swelling reduced. Outside the window, Lara whispered to herself, almost rhythmically. She was drawing again, now sketching Scar as a blur behind a tree. Later that afternoon, Ben was reviewing camera footage from the outer trails when he spotted something troubling, a figure in camo gear, holding what looked like wire cutters. The timestamp showed it was recorded 2 days ago. He paused, frowning. No one was authorized to be out there, except registered personnel, and this wasn't one of them. He called in Officer Dean Keller, a local deputy assigned part-time to the reserve. Dean was in his 40s, a solidly built man with light eyes and a deep drawl. A former Marine turned small-town lawman, he had little patience for paperwork, but a sharp instinct for patterns. "That's no hiker," Dean muttered, pointing at the screen. "That's a trap runner. We've had a few around these parts, but they never came this close to the protected zones." Ben nodded grimly. "He's the reason Ellie's bleeding." Dean patted his sidearm. "Let's pay a visit to the South Ridge." As they set out, clouds gathered again over the mountains. Not a storm this time, but a dense, waiting kind of sky, the kind that held its breath. Scar watched them from a distance. He knew the scent of the man from the footage, and he knew he would have to intercept if they were too late. That night, Rosa stayed with Ellie, watching her breathing settle into a rhythm that was no longer ragged. Lara came by once, left a small drawing near the door, a picture of Ellie standing under a tree with stars above her, and beside her, a figure made of spots and scars. Outside, just past the fence, 2 glowing amber eyes blinked from the underbrush. Not close, not far, just watching. The sun never fully rose that day over Blue Haven. It hovered like a faded coin behind thickening clouds, casting a pale light that made every tree appear darker, every shadow deeper. The wind picked up before noon, slow at first, then stronger, carrying the scent of moss and electricity. Something was coming, something wild. Scar moved with urgency through the underbrush. His paw was still sore from the cut, but he ignored it. He had picked up a scent again, not just of metal or oil, but of sweat, stale chewing tobacco, and something sharper, a man's fear poorly hidden beneath his aggression. The poacher had returned. Scar didn't know the word for it, but he knew the intention. He had survived long enough to smell malice. At the center's western gate, Officer Dean Keller adjusted his utility belt and leaned against the hood of the Jeep. His uniform was damp with sweat and mud, his brow furrowed beneath a camo-patterned cap. He'd been circling the perimeter with Ben since dawn, finding fresh signs, boot prints near the creek, a pile of feathers that didn't belong to any known predator. "I don't like this," he muttered. Ben, rifle slung over one shoulder, scanned the trail ahead. "He's too close. He's either arrogant or desperate." Dean snorted. "Or both." Back at the veterinary wing, Ellie stirred on her straw-covered bedding. The sedation had worn off completely, and she had begun to eat small portions of fruit and hay again. Her leg remained stiff, wrapped in gauze, but the bleeding had stopped. Rosa sat nearby, scribbling notes on a clipboard with her usual focus. Her quiet demeanor had a grounding effect on the room. She rarely spoke unless necessary, but her presence radiated calm, one forged not by ease, but by years of tending creatures on the brink. At her side, Lara had been granted special permission to visit. She sat in silence near the wall, doodling softly. Today she was sketching the weather, a storm with curled lightning above the trees and a leopard crouched beneath it. "I think he's going to fight again," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Rosa glanced at her. Who? Lara didn't answer. She didn't need to. By late afternoon, the wind had turned cold and sharp. Thunder cracked low across the mountains, a slow groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Dean and Ben had just reached the outer fence near the marsh when the first pellets of hail began to fall, small, sharp-like teeth bouncing off their jackets and hitting the leaves like scattered gravel. "Let's move," Ben said. "We need to get back before this worsens." But Scar had already found him. The man, late 30s, lean frame wrapped in an oversized green parka, was kneeling in a clearing no more than a mile from the reserve fence. His name was Travis Beckett, a former trapper from northern Georgia, banned from multiple state parks for illegal hunting. His face was thin and drawn, with hollow eyes that rarely blinked. A scar ran across his knuckles, and his left boot was duct-taped at the sole. His gaze was fixed on the snare he had just reset, this time, larger, meant for something stronger than a fox. He didn't hear Scar until it was too late. The leopard emerged not with a roar, but a blur of speed and muscle. Travis fell back, reaching for the rifle slung across his chest. But Scar was faster. He charged, teeth bared, eyes wild. Travis fired one shot that went wide, cracking into a nearby tree. Scar didn't stop. He struck, claws slashing the man's forearm, knocking the rifle away. But Travis wasn't unarmed. With a swift motion, he pulled a hunting knife from his belt and swung, grazing Scar's shoulder. The leopard snarled, furious, and leapt again. It was not a clean fight. It was raw, violent, primal. Blood hit the snow-dusted ground as man and beast clashed in a storm of rage and instinct. The hail turned heavier, blinding. Dean and Ben, hearing the gunshot, rushed toward the sound, weaving through trees slick with ice. They arrived to find Travis on the ground, panting, one arm bleeding heavily. Scar stood a few feet away, sides heaving, a long gash now visible along his ribs. His tail lashed once. He stared at Ben not with fear, but recognition. Then, without a sound, he vanished into the trees, swallowed by hail and fog. Dean rushed to Travis and kicked the knife away. "You're done, Beckett." Ben knelt, breathless. He didn't ask what had happened. The blood, the snare, the missing weapon. It said enough. Back at the center, Lara looked up suddenly from her drawing. "He's hurt," she whispered, "but he's okay." Scar limped through the trees under cover of storm. His breathing was shallow, but his pace steady. He found a dry patch beneath a rock ledge, curled up, and lay still. The wound on his ribs pulsed, but he did not close his eyes. He was watching. He was always watching. By nightfall, the storm had passed. Ellie slept peacefully, trunk twitching as if chasing dreams. In the ranger office, Ben filled out a report for the state authority, but paused before writing the last sentence. He finally wrote, "Leopard intercepted poacher during storm. No fatalities. Ellie safe. Scar still out there?" The storm had stripped the forest of its noise. Branches sagged with ice, and leaves hung in stunned silence beneath the pale dawn sky. Blue Haven stirred slowly under the morning frost, like a wounded beast waking from uneasy sleep. The sun pierced through the mist in narrow beams, and everything it touched seemed to shimmer. A world momentarily suspended between damage and healing. At the clinic, Ellie's breath rose in gentle puffs of steam. Her eyes fluttered open and closed, as if still unsure whether she was safe. Her leg remained bound in clean gauze, and the swelling had begun to ease. Rosa entered the barn quietly, her hoodie sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hands stained with iodine. Her gentle manner had not faded despite the long night. She paused at Ellie's side, pressing a soft hand to the calf's forehead. "Still fighting, little one," she whispered, then scribbled a note on the chart. Lara stood by the barn door, arms crossed, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. She hadn't drawn since the hailstorm. Something in her felt different, disrupted. She watched Ellie, but her gaze often drifted to the tree line beyond the enclosure. Her silence had become more intense charged. Ben had barely slept. After filing the official report and helping Dean transport the injured poacher to the county station, he returned to the ranger cabin and sat alone, staring at the old tin mug his late wife had left behind. Her name was Anna. She had once told him that the line between wild and human wasn't fear, it was trust. He wondered if she would have believed in the leopard. He looked out the window toward the ridge. Scar hadn't returned, at least not visibly. Meanwhile, deeper in the forest, Scar lay beneath a felled oak, the gash on his ribs sticky with dried blood. The pain was bearable. What gnawed at him more was the absence, the lack of scent from the calf. He had learned her smell, a subtle mixture of damp straw, salt, and young bark. It no longer drifted freely on the wind. She was not near. That made him restless. Scar stood, staggered slightly, then righted himself and limped in a wide arc back toward the southern boundary of the reserve. He didn't know why he returned, only that he needed to. At the same time, a new presence arrived at Blue Haven. Dr. Isaiah Monroe, a wildlife policy official from the State Department, stepped out of a black SUV. He was in his late 40s, sharply dressed in a charcoal gray overcoat, with clipped speech and calculating eyes. Tall and lean, with a face that rarely betrayed emotion, Monroe was known among conservation circles as a man of procedure, not poetry. Ben met him at the gate. "You filed a report saying a leopard defended an elephant calf from a poacher," Monroe said without greeting. "I did," Ben replied, keeping his voice even. Monroe raised a brow. "You realize how that sounds?" Ben didn't blink. "Like the truth." Monroe sighed and followed him toward the clinic. "We'll need footage, behavioral logs, witness testimony." "I'll give you what I can," Ben said, "but you won't understand it on paper." Inside, Ellie stirred as Monroe approached. Rosa stepped protectively to her side. Laura watched the man from across the room, her fingers tightening around her sketchbook. "Has the leopard returned?" Monroe asked Rosa. "No," she said, voice clipped. "Good." Monroe nodded. "I'll recommend tranquilization and relocation if he does. We can't allow sentiment to override safety." Laura's voice cut through the barn like a blade. "He's not dangerous." Monroe turned, surprised. "Excuse me?" Laura stared at him. "He saved her. You weren't here." Monroe looked at Ben. "I didn't realize children were part of the field team now." Ben bristled. "She's the only reason we found Ellie in time." That night, Laura slipped from the cabin in her coat and boots and walked the perimeter fence in silence. A half-moon hovered above the treetops. She reached a clearing near the ridge and sat cross-legged in the frost. And then she waited. It was nearly midnight when Scar appeared. He didn't emerge dramatically. He simply stepped from the shadows, limping slightly, eyes catching the moonlight. Laura did not move. Scar didn't either. They sat like that for minutes. Two beings connected by something wordless. Finally, Scar took a slow step closer. Laura reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded drawing. She placed it on the ground and backed away. Scar sniffed it. It was crude but clear, a leopard and a calf beneath a canopy of stars. He blinked slowly, then turned and disappeared into the forest. The next morning, Monroe had planned to recommend intervention, but when he reviewed the security footage from the night before, he saw something that made him pause. A child and a predator, unguarded, at peace. He said nothing. 2 days later, Ellie was moved to the outer paddock. She stood for the first time without assistance, though her legs still trembled. Laura cheered quietly from the edge of the fence. In the distance, hidden by tall grass and low trees, a pair of amber eyes watched. The guardian had returned not to fight, not to be seen, but simply to remain. The morning frost had not yet melted when Laura arrived at the paddock, her boots crunching lightly over the half-frozen earth. The trees surrounding Blue Haven stood quiet, as if waiting for something. In the pale light, Ellie stood near the fence, her trunk slowly moving back and forth, brushing the cold air like she was tasting its meaning. Her legs still trembled with effort, but she didn't collapse. Not anymore. Rosa approached from the barn with a tray of chopped fruit and fresh leaves. The fatigue in her eyes had deepened, but she wore it with quiet resilience. As always, her gestures were precise, her movements economical. She said little, but when she passed Laura, she offered a small nod, one of acknowledgement rather than command. The two had developed a kind of understanding. Quiet people who listened more than they spoke, each holding space for the wounded in their own way. Ben was at the ranger station, reviewing satellite maps of the reserve's border. He traced a trail with his fingertip. The path Scar had likely taken the night of the storm. Though still officially undocumented, Ben knew the leopard's habits now, at least partially. Scar never came close to human structures during daylight. He stayed hidden, always observing, his presence marked only by the brief flicker of amber eyes or a paw print just deep enough to disturb the frost. Across from him sat Eliza Whitmore, a senior field researcher recently transferred from Yellowstone. Eliza was in her mid-30s, with freckled skin, a wild tangle of copper hair pulled into a scarf, and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that could silence a room. She had once studied wolves, tracking their reintroduction into the wild, but left after a failed expedition led to the death of 2 pups due to delayed rescue, something that hardened her. She had since turned her attention to solitary predators. "So, this scar?" Eliza said, crossing her arms over her thick canvas jacket. "You're telling me he's formed an emotional bond with a prey species?" Ben glanced at her. "I'm telling you, he's not behaving the way a textbook says he should." Eliza leaned back. Textbooks weren't written by animals. Meanwhile, Laura had slipped inside the paddock under Rose's watchful but permitting eye. She approached Ellie with slow, unhurried steps, stopping just a few feet away. The young elephant didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and lowered her trunk. Laura extended a small hand and let it rest on the thick, wrinkled skin between Ellie's eyes. It was the first time she had touched her since the rescue. "Do you think he's watching again?" Laura whispered. Ellie didn't answer, of course, but her stillness was an answer of its own. Out at the tree line, hidden behind a low ridge, Scar lay crouched in the brush. His rib wound had scabbed over, but still ached during the colder mornings. He ignored it. His eyes were fixed on the paddock. On them. The calf and the girl. Especially the girl. He didn't know what she was, but something about her movement, her quiet approach, her strange stillness mirrored the wild in him. Just behind Scar, a rustle stirred. He turned sharply, muscles tensing. A red fox emerged, young and wiry, its fur patchy from early season mange. It paused when it saw Scar, then darted off without a sound. Scar didn't pursue. He only watched it vanish, the same way he always watched things leave. At lunch, Monroe returned. The state official had been unusually silent after reviewing the nighttime footage, but today he seemed recharged, clipboard in hand. He walked with brisk steps toward Ben and Eliza in the ranger office, eyes narrowed. "I've spoken to my superiors," he said. "The department wants the leopard trapped and relocated to a controlled facility for observation." Ben's jaw tensed. "He hasn't posed a threat to anyone." "Yet," Monroe corrected. "You don't wait for a predator to become unpredictable." "It already is unpredictable," Eliza added, though her tone was more curious than confrontational. "That's the point." Monroe ignored her. "If he shows again near the paddock, I'll authorize a tranquilizer team to move in. We can't afford the risk." That afternoon, Scar returned. Laura had been sitting alone again, this time outside the paddock fence, sketching quietly with a piece of charcoal. Ellie dozed nearby. As the wind shifted, she looked up, and there he was. Not behind the trees, not in the distance. He stood 20 feet away, body low but unthreatening. His coat dappled with shadow and light. The scab on his rib was visible, and a faint limp still marked his step. He didn't growl. He didn't approach. He simply looked. Laura didn't move. Slowly, she held up a new drawing. It showed a leopard sitting beside a young elephant under a tree. No fences, no humans. Just them. She placed it on the ground and took a step back. Scar blinked. Then he did something no one expected. He sat. Not crouched, not ready to leap. He simply folded his legs beneath him and rested in place, facing her. Eliza, watching from the distance with binoculars, lowered them in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like it," she murmured, "not even in controlled behavior labs." Ben didn't say a word. He just kept watching. Eventually, Rosa came out, calling softly for Laura. The girl turned, nodded once, and walked back, never once looking over her shoulder. Scar remained for a while longer, then stood and vanished once again into the trees. That night, Monroe made one last call to the department. "I think," he said slowly into the phone, "we may be looking at something beyond protocol." The days that followed felt quieter, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Winter crept in with fingers of frost lacing the wooden fences, silvering the leaves and blanketing the mountain trails in hush. In the pale hours of dawn, the animals at Blue Haven stirred slowly, not out of fear, but of awareness, as if some rhythm greater than weather was shifting in the trees. Ellie's limp had become less pronounced. She no longer stood stiff and uncertain, but moved with purpose, her steps measured, her trunk occasionally raised toward the wind. The deep wound on her leg had closed into a pink seam beneath a cleaner wrap. Her recovery had gone beyond the physical. There was now alertness in her gaze, a sense of confidence restored. At the paddock gate, Lara leaned on the wooden post, watching Ellie's movements as she sketched slowly. Her long braid draped over one shoulder, and her cheeks were tinged red from the cold. She no longer waited for someone to prompt her to speak. Each morning, she came early and stayed late, not out of obligation, but instinct. Ben, observing from the ranger tower above, noted her growing confidence with a mix of relief and wonder. He was beginning to realize that the more Ellie healed, the more Lara changed too. Not with dramatic transformation, but in subtle ways. A steadier gait, longer moments of eye contact, a small laugh once in a while that used to be rare. Down by the main office, Eliza Whitmore crouched beside a trail camera, checking the footage from the past 48 hours. Her copper curls were tucked beneath a woolen cap, her gloved fingers moving deftly despite the chill. She had always believed herself skeptical to a fault, trained to dismiss emotional projection onto wild animals. But something about Scar challenged all her academic defenses. "There's something happening here," she muttered aloud. "Something you can't graph on a behavior chart?" Rosa asked, standing behind her, arms folded. Rosa had grown increasingly observant of Eliza, how the once detached scientist now lingered longer near the paddock, how her field notes were less clinical, more questioning. Eliza smirked. "Yeah, annoyingly so." Inside the footage, a brief frame showed Scar again, watching from behind the same cedar tree, his body still, his eyes glowing in the night vision. He hadn't approached since the moment he sat facing Lara, but he had not vanished either. His presence was less a threat now, more a shadow of reassurance. Then came a new ripple. That afternoon, the outer fence sensor on the north trail pinged. Ben and Dean responded immediately, rifles slung, walking in cautious formation. At first, they suspected it might be Scar again, but what they found instead was far more troubling. A stray dog, likely a shepherd mix, limped out from the underbrush. His coat was matted and caked in mud, ribs showing, one eye clouded by an old wound. He was young, maybe a year old, but already carried the hardened gait of survival. When Dean approached, the dog growled once, then collapsed from exhaustion. Back at the clinic, Rosa tended to the canine carefully. "He's dehydrated, starving, but not aggressive," she reported. "Old trap scar on the leg. Looks like he's been through a few human camps." Lara sat near the dog's temporary pen, sketching his profile. She didn't name him, but labeled the drawing, "One Who Survived." Later that night, Scar returned to the paddock. This time, Ellie was awake. She stood quietly at the fence, not afraid, not surprised. From her perspective, the leopard was no longer a stranger. He was something else, part guardian, part memory. The wind shifted and she let out a low rumble, soft and questioning. Scar didn't step forward. He just stood in the moonlight, his scarred coat shimmering faintly. After a while, he turned and began to walk the perimeter, slowly, deliberately, until he disappeared behind the eastern rise. Unbeknownst to him, someone was watching from higher ground. Monroe had returned for a follow-up visit and stood alone on the tower deck, arms crossed against the cold. He had arrived earlier that evening under the pretense of reviewing facility policies. But the truth was less official. Something about this place had begun to crack through his well-armored pragmatism. From his vantage point, he saw the way the calf had stood. He saw how the leopard didn't behave like a predator, didn't linger like a beast plotting territory. He saw instead something he couldn't quite name. And for the first time, he didn't reach for his radio. The next morning, Ellie wandered closer to the edge of the paddock where the fence met the old tree line. There, in the soft earth, was a paw print, larger than any dog's, deeper than most cats', perfectly pressed into the soil. She lowered her trunk and gently touched it. Lara, walking beside her with a sketchbook under her arm, followed the gaze and smiled. Back at the kennel, the rescued dog, now nicknamed Ash by Rosa, had begun to eat again. His spirit was cautious, but not broken. He followed Rosa slowly from room to room, never touching her hand, but never letting her out of sight. Dean, observing this, remarked, "Looks like your shadow's growing a tail." Rosa smiled faintly, for once not denying it. And somewhere in the forest, Scar stood on a high ridge, the morning sun warming the old wound on his ribs. It no longer hurt. Not because it had healed completely, but because he had chosen not to carry the pain alone. The snow came earlier than expected. By the end of the first week of December, the Blue Ridge Mountains had been brushed in white, not heavy, but enough to soften the edges of every path and hill, as if the world had decided to speak only in whispers. Icicles hung from the edges of the observation deck, and the trees stood like watchful ghosts, silent under their icy veils. Ellie stood at the edge of the paddock that morning, her trunk extended toward the frost-covered fence, touching the metal lightly. Her limp had all but vanished. She moved steadily now, her muscles regaining their strength with surprising grace. But something in her posture had shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was searching. Lara, bundled in a thick beige coat with fur lining, her breath forming little clouds in the cold, sat cross-legged near the gate, drawing lines in the snow with the back of her pencil. She hadn't seen Scar in 3 days, not even a paw print. Inside the clinic, Rosa stood over Ash, the shepherd mix, now stronger and alert, his coat cleaner, his eyes more open. The cloudy eye remained, but the other gleamed with sharp amber light. Ash followed Rosa with unspoken loyalty, his tail twitching slightly whenever she stepped into the room. He had become something of a quiet symbol, another scarred creature, watching and waiting. "I think he's looking for someone," Rosa murmured to Jamal, who had returned for the week. Jamal, tall and gentle with a baritone voice, knelt beside the dog, running a hand along his back. "Or maybe," he said, "he's realizing he's found them." Ash leaned into the touch. Outside, Eliza stood near the feeding shed, arms crossed over a thick navy parka. She had refused to leave after her assignment was supposed to end, saying she needed more data. But everyone knew the data had turned into something else. Her field journal had grown less structured, filled with questions like, "Do some animals sense what we choose to ignore?" She noticed Ben approaching, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You ever feel like this place is keeping secrets from us?" she asked, half smiling. Ben handed her a mug. "Not secrets, just things we're not ready to hear." As the sun rose higher, the staff busied themselves preparing for the upcoming rewilding of Ellie. The vet team had declared her fit for reintegration, slowly and with monitoring. A plan had been laid out. She would be taken to a protected clearing 5 miles north, near where her original herd had passed before the snow. A team would track her transition over the coming weeks. But Lara hadn't smiled since they had announced it. "She's not ready," she told her father softly that night. "She's strong, sweetheart," Ben replied. "She's not alone." "That's not what I mean." The next morning, Monroe returned for a final field review before the rewilding. His coat was immaculate, dark wool and tailored. He looked almost out of place against the rustic buildings and muddied snow. But there was something different in his gateless, rigid slower. He watched as Ellie was led toward the transport crate with surprising calm. She didn't resist, just paused once and looked back toward the ridge, toward the place where she had always seen him last. Still, no sign of Scar. Lara didn't speak that day. The journey to the northern field was uneventful. Ben drove the lead vehicle, Rosa and Jamal followed in the supply truck, while Lara rode in the back seat, silent and still. Ellie shifted softly in the crate, occasionally pressing her trunk to the wood wall. The team worked quickly once they arrived, unlocking the transport gate and guiding her into the clearing. And then something strange happened. Ellie refused to walk forward. She stood just beyond the threshold of the crate, her legs locked, her ears flared, her body tense, not afraid, but reluctant. Lara stepped down from the truck and approached. "She's waiting," she whispered. Eliza, watching through binoculars, scanned the tree line, and then she saw him. Scar stood on the far hill, half shrouded by pine, his figure still as stone. He was thinner now, more worn, but no less majestic. Snow clung to his back like ash on old armor. His gaze met Ellie's, then Lara's. He did not move forward. He did not run. He turned slowly and walked away. Lara didn't cry. She simply placed a hand on the crate's wooden edge. She understands now. Ellie stepped forward. No one spoke. The snow fell in quiet threads as the calf walked into the wild again, her stride sure, her presence whole. That night, back at the camp, Lara took out a clean page in her sketchbook. She drew the ridge, blanketed in snow. At the center stood Scar, just a shadow. But his eyes were open, and above him, stars broke through the clouds. She titled the page, He left, but not because he stopped watching. The snow had not melted, but spring was already whispering beneath it. It had been almost 6 weeks since Ellie was rewilded into the northern clearing of Blue Haven. The staff had tracked her progress from afar, monitoring her movement via the small, non-invasive tracker attached to her leg. To everyone's surprise, she had not only adapted quickly, she had taken a leadership role among a small herd that had migrated back through the area. Stronger, more aware, more grounded. Lara still visited the paddock each morning, even though it now stood empty. She no longer waited to see Ellie or Scar, but she always brought her sketchbook and left a drawing on the post before she left. Small acts, quiet rituals. Ash, the shepherd mix, had grown into a healthy, steady presence at the sanctuary. Though his right ear remained half torn and one eye clouded, his body had filled out, his coat had thickened, and he followed Rosa like a second shadow. He had taken to lying under the bench near the clinic porch, watching every newcomer with a subtle tilt of his head. He barked rarely, once at a fox that came too close, once at a storm that broke too fast, and once, curiously, at the open field when there was nothing to be seen. Ben had resumed daily rounds with renewed energy. There was something lighter about him these days. He smiled more, talked more with Lara, and even let Rosa convince him to start digitizing the reserve's wildlife journal, a task he had resisted for years. One morning, during a particularly bright thaw, the sanctuary received a visit from Sylvia Jameson, a wildlife documentarian in her early 40s, known for her raw, unfiltered footage of animal behavior in places humans weren't meant to tread. Sylvia had an untamed dark brown skin marked by sun exposure, curly hair pulled into a frayed bun, and a camera slung across her shoulder like it was part of her body. She spoke quickly, moved faster, and saw everything with the precision of someone used to waiting hours for a single meaningful shot. "I heard about the Leopard," Sylvia said, sipping the bitter camp coffee. "The one who didn't behave like a predator." Ben nodded. "He hasn't been seen in weeks. But he changed things." "He did," Ben replied, "just not in the way we're used to recording." Sylvia stayed for 3 days, filming the empty paddock, the tracks Ellie once left behind, Lara's drawings pinned to the gate, and Ash's quiet routines. She never once faked a moment. On her last night, she asked Lara a question on camera. "What do you think happened to Scar?" Lara didn't answer immediately. Then she looked directly into the lens and said, "He didn't leave. He just doesn't need to be seen anymore." 3 days after Sylvia left, a heavy fog rolled in from the valley. It coated the reserve in a silver silence, and even the birds seemed to hush beneath its weight. That morning, Rosa opened the barn and stopped in her tracks. There, standing just beyond the edge of the paddock, was a figure that didn't move. Scar, older, leaner, the scar on his rib still visible, but faded now to a white slash against golden-brown fur. His eyes were calm. There was no tension in his stance, no threat. Just presence. Ash stood at the clinic porch and didn't bark. He watched, a low wag of his tail, almost respectful. Ben stepped out, binoculars dangling at his chest. He froze, heart quickening. Slowly, he raised the lens. Scar met his gaze. Not directly, not challengingly, but with something that felt like memory. Lara was the last to step out. She saw him and didn't move. She just stood there, holding her breath. Scar remained for nearly 10 minutes. He looked at the paddock, then toward the open field, then back toward the people who had once watched him from behind fences and windows. And then, just as silently as he had come, he turned and walked into the fog, his tail low, his stride measured. This time, no one followed. Later that day, Rosa found a fresh print in the mud near the back fence. Next to it was something unusual, a long, vertical scratch on the bark of a tree, not from aggression, but deliberate, marking, perhaps, a farewell. That evening, Lara drew her last picture in the book, Scar walking into mist, his silhouette merging with trees, and above him, a small glowing eye Ellie's, watching from the branches. She closed the book gently and placed it on the shelf in Ben's office. "We don't need to wait anymore," she said. In the days that followed, the reserve took on a new kind of rhythm. Ellie remained wild, but rangers often found signs she returned at night half-moon, prints near the pond, scraped bark where she rubbed her side, gentle mounds of hay pulled into nests near old fences. Scar was never seen again, not truly. But sometimes, just before dawn, Ash would lift his head from sleep and stare into the trees. And Lara would draw again, not because she was waiting, but because she understood now that some spirits never leave. They simply choose to walk further than our eyes can follow. Sometimes healing doesn't come from those we expect. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the scarred, the misunderstood, who stand between us and the dark. In the wild and in our own lives, compassion doesn't always roar. It watches, it stays, it chooses to protect, even when no one is watching. If this story touched you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who still believes in silent kindness. And tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone or something that changed your life without saying a word?